I moved to London in 1994. I was 52 years old, had been a lawyer, government official, culture warrior, the head of what was called a public interest law firm in the United States, had made enough money that I didn't have to keep working, and was thoroughly dissatisfied with the United States. I'd never been comfortable in the U.S., and discovered just how uncomfortable I'd been when I first went to England in 1964. I came up to Cambridge, to St. John's College on a fluke, enjoyed the time there, perhaps was educated in part, and I'll refer to that later, and then went back to America because I'd been conditioned, as all American kids were at that time, and could not really conceive of expatriating when I was 24 years old. I had a number of careers or specialties as a lawyer from the time I graduated from Yale in 1969 until I left in 1994. I had not written anything at that point, at least not anything that was published. I had certainly kept notes and always had a dream of being a writer, but had no idea that one day that would actually happen. Britain has a much more literary culture than does America. In London, I found business people that I dealt with and people I met in art galleries were interested in literature, were interested in poetry, which is what I valued most highly and what I dreamed about writing. And so I began to rummage through the notes I'd been making over the years, and in the early aughts turned my attention to trying to write something that was acceptable poetry, or at least something that wouldn't embarrass me. I spent several years at it. The wife of one of my business associates offered to edit some of what I was writing. But the effort, the composition, was for me. It was to see if I could master the craft of poetry in part, if not in whole, and was not undertaken. I didn't have any idea that I would ever become a published poet, and I didn't submit my work for publication to any of the magazines. I come from a fairly rough part of Philadelphia. They're definitely main streets. My father was a butcher, and he had just been born in the United States, the son of Jewish refugees from the Pale. And my mother's family were pretty serious criminals. They ran a criminal enterprise in Philadelphia. My Uncle Al was a hitman. And my sister just sent me an article from 1930 in which I read that my grandfather had just been arrested in a parking garage for having murdered or attempted to murder an attendant. And so my Uncle Al had the best kind of instruction, clearly, his father. My education until I went to college had been that of what I've learned the people in the neighborhood called that of a juvenile delinquent. I was a poor student in secondary school, and it was only by the grace of friendship with a teacher at my secondary school that I ended up at a small Catholic college. And then, quite by accident, went to St. John's College, Cambridge, and then life began to function the way one would expect, with some credentials under their belt. Michael began pushing me to write about this world that I'd come from, and he used various arguments. The one that he stressed was that it would help with my poetry. I had a horror of writing about myself in prose, and certainly about my background, because it seemed self-indulgent, egotistical, and to a large extent irrelevant. Michael pushed the argument about improving my practice, my craft, poetic craft, such as it is, very hard. And finally, I did as he asked and wrote 40,000 words about my background, which, as much as I could, eliminated me. It was about the people I knew and the places they'd come from. Michael published it as part of my first collection of poetry. And after that, Michael continued to suggest I expand that short piece. The people that read it were many of them were taken with it. And a fair number of people asked me, well, what happened next? Because it had covered my life from the time I was born until I went off to Cambridge. In time, I answered the questions about what happened next in the course of trying to figure out how I'd come to make what I saw as, and anyone would see as serious mistakes in my life, one of which was returning from Cambridge to America rather than staying in Britain and making my life there. I'm going to read from several sections of what became the book that Carcanet is now publishing, Every Wrong Direction, a memoir which includes the first bit of memoir I wrote, which was published originally as Certain Windows, and talks about my experiences until I left America and took up residence and then citizenship in Great Britain. The title of the book is Every Wrong Direction. The title comes from a song by Chris Christopherson called The Pilgrim, chapter 33, which goes, as I recall, he's a poet, he's a picker, he's a prophet, he's a pusher. He's a pilgrim and a preacher and a problem when he's stoned. He's a walking contradiction, partly truth and partly fiction, taking every wrong direction on his lonely way back home. And this book, this memoir, Every Wrong Direction, is about how I came to make the wrong turnings that I did before moving to Britain, surrendering my U.S. citizenship, and throwing in my lot in the only country where I've been happy. I'm reading now from the beginning of Every Wrong Direction, the first chapter called Ancestral Houses. This first section is about my grandparents, especially my grandfather. Ancestral Houses, 4th and Daly. Joe Burt, my father, was born in Boston in 1916, almost 9 months to the day after his mother landed there from a shtetl near Kiev. She brought with her Eva, her firstborn, and Bernie, her second. Presumably my grandfather, Louis, whom we called Zeta, or Pop, was pleased to see my grandmother Rose, or Mom, even though she was generally regarded as a Chalaria, which is Yiddish for shrew. Zeta had been dragooned into the Russian army a little before the outbreak of World War I. Russia levied a quota of Jewish men for the army from each shtetl, and these men invariably came from the poorest shtetlachim, i.e. shtetl dwellers. Zeta deserted at the earliest opportunity, which was certainly not unusual, made his way to Boston, and sent for Mom. Mom and Pop moved the family in 1917 to a small row house at 4th and Daly in South Philadelphia, the neighborhood where my father grew up, worked, and married. Pop was a carpenter, Mom a seamstress, both socialists at least, if not communists. Mom was an organizer for the International Lady Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, which seems in character. Yiddish was the household tongue, my father's first, though Pop spoke and read Russian and English fluently. Mom managed Russian well, but English took more effort. The family's daily newspaper was Vorwärts, Forward, printed in Yiddish. Vorwärts published lists of those killed in pogroms when they occurred. Ukrainian Cossacks allied themselves with the Bolsheviks and used the Russian Civil War as an excuse to continue the pogroms that had been a fact of Jewish life in the Pale from the 1880s. Pop was hanging from a trolley car strap on his way home from work in 1920 when he read the names of his family among the dead, all 18 of them, father, mother, sisters, brothers, their children. He had become an orphan. He never went to synagogue again. A few years later, he learned how they were killed when some of Mom's family, who had hidden during the raid, emigrated to America. I heard the story from him when I was 10, at Christmas, 1952. I came home singing Silent Night, newly learned in my local public elementary school. I couldn't stop singing it, and went caroling up the back steps from the alley into our kitchen, where Pop, putty-colored, in his mid-60s, and dying of cancer, was making what turned out to be his last visit. Zeta had cause to dislike Gentile sacred songs, though I didn't know it. He croaked, "Danila, shah still." "Danny, shut up." And I answered, "No, why should I?" His face flushed with all the life left in him, and he grabbed me by the neck and started choking me. My father pulled him off, pinioned his arms, and when his rage had passed, led me to the kitchen table, where Zeta sat at the head and told me this story. The Jews had warning of a raid. Zeta's father, my great-grandfather, was pious and reputed to be a Melamed, a learned though poor Orthodox Jew. As such, he was prized and protected by the community. Pop's in-laws urged him to take his family and hide with them in their shelter below the street. Great-grandfather refused. He said, so I was told, "God will protect us." The Cossacks rousted them from their house and forced everyone to strip. They raped the women while the men watched. Done, they shot the women, then the children, and last the men. They murdered all 18 of them, my every paternal forebear, excepting Pop, who went to die an atheist, as did my father. A story like that stays with you for a long time. In my case, it scarred me and stayed with me for the rest of my life. I was aware of anti-Semitism, even though my mother wasn't Jewish. It was something you had to fight about, and I did. But that story in particular, and of course stories my father told me in watching him fight anti-Semites bored into me. I'll now read from the very last part of Every Wrong Direction, Part 5, Last Window. Cambridge, 2021. For even life in exile is not as bad as life alone in one's own country. That's from Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday. I left U.S. public life within weeks after the Westmoreland case ended, and never saw or spoke with the General again, or any of the Capital Legal Foundation lawyers, or anyone from CBS or Cravath. I declined all but 2 requests for interviews, which I gave within days of the settlement. In both, I refused to discuss it. For 35 years, I said nothing about the case to anyone, not to reporters, acquaintances, wives, nor lovers. As always, after deep disappointment, I left the field. Shut up, hold up, took the hit, took stock. To disappoint someone often demands premeditation. What useful explanation or insight can you expect from someone who has just taken pains to screw you? You can know or deduce with some accuracy why someone disappointed you. Insecurity, my father. Self-interest, Tom Field, General Westmoreland. Greed and jealousy, the partners at Burt and Taylor. The advent of a preferred lover, Cynthia dropping me for another man. Inquiry merely prolongs the pain and gives cheats like the partner's satisfaction. In childhood, I learned it's weak, shameful, and useless to reveal you've been cut to the quick. Better cauterize the wound and move on. Abandoning the field of loss forces and hastens reflection, analysis, acceptance, and recovery. If revenge is called for, hiding your reaction to disappointment facilitates it. It was not bravado, but survival that stopped me whimpering after the Westmoreland case concluded without a decision. The press pilloried me, as CBS's PR consultant John Scanlon had promised and almost certainly facilitated. The Washington Post, a leading national newspaper and my hometown's broadsheet, devoted its Sunday features section, beginning on its front page, to reprinting an article from a legal gossip sheet saying I'd abandoned the General. Other than from Boyce, my opposite counsel, there was no word of sympathy, comfort, or encouragement from my legal peers, and none from former law school classmates. I stayed stumm. What the General had blurted out that afternoon in my office lay buried beneath the attorney-client privilege, his to assert till death. Even had it not bound me, I would have sat mute in the stocks, as befits a fool. There, pelted by garbage, I dwelt on the confluence of arrogance and rage that set me in them, the incompatibility that from youth unsettled my life in America, where my fists seemed always clenched, and what might free me. In the late 1970s, I'd contemplated moving to England. The stated rationale to open a London office for Burt and Taylor. However, I viewed it as the first step in emigrating. I scouted offices in the Inns of Court and opened negotiations to buy land I'd found on the sea in Ireland to build a country house. The partners' coup at Burt and Taylor and my consequent return to policy work in D.C. cashiered both plans. Now, at a slug's pace, I resurrected them. I resumed practicing international law and soon founded my second law firm. It grew quickly, but with British, not U.S. clients. The heart of the practice, international tax advice for FTSE 100 companies with U.S. subsidiaries. Significant U.S.-based clients were non-existent. Things went better for me on the Atlantic's eastern than its western shores, both socially and commercially. Was it a coincidence that both law practices I'd built were rooted outside and east of the United States? Or that my third wife was British? I'd been uneasy in America since returning from Cambridge 20 years earlier. The Westmoreland case taught me that it was more than unease that dogged me. It was anger. Elements of U.S. society were intolerable. The pressure to conform, the religiosity, the bigotry, the triumphal white Christian nationalism and smugness going under the rubric of American exceptionalism, the provinciality to be endured if I was to practice law for U.S. clients and rub along happily in Uncle Sam's society. I began to appreciate that in the States, unconventionality rouses suspicion, whereas in Britain it's welcomed. More problematic than my origins, class, wealth, or ethnicity, my indifference, irreverence, and atheism set my American teeth grinding. The U.S. charge sheet listed unorthodoxy, eccentricity, and novelty as my crimes, character flaws too deep for extirpation. America generally does not welcome eccentric or unorthodox views, especially in the practice of corporate law. Leading lawyers there practice in giant firms, and U.S. legal practice, unlike British, does not have barristers who must practice alone. There is no cognate in American English for the British phrase, horses for courses. American xenophobia, currently on prominent display, fears and shuns those who are out of sync in trade or lifestyle. The land of opportunity may be a melting pot, but it's outsiders who melt. There, I would always be out of step, hands balled for brawling. I live in England now, exiled by choice. 27 years ago, I moved here from D.C., became a Brit, and 16 years ago, renounced my U.S. citizenship. Thomas Wolfe maintained you can't go home again. Literally true in my case. I kept the seaside house in Maine when I left and visited it several times a year, but by law, cannot stay too long or return to live there. Entering America, I snaked through the aliens channel at passport control like every other British citizen. Leaving, I board a flight east, the right direction to Heathrow. There, I used the UK passports channel and never clench my fist. It's the end of the Know Your Author piece. Peace as.